Social movements can be powerful political forces. They can challenge governments and other powerful entities to behave differently and even cause their downfall. While transnational social movements have existed for some time, current advances in communication technologies in an increasingly connected world allows these movements to be linked more easily into global networks that transcend any one community or nation. This research examines how these powerful social movements organize and challenge global politics as usual. In international relations and studies of geopolitics, we know a lot about the geography of how governments and militaries operate across space and around the world. We are familiar with the geographies of borders, military power, diplomacy, statecraft, and geopolitical maneuvering. What, however, do we know about the social movements that challenge these governments? How do these kinds of groups organize and deploy power across space? To examine this study built upon my previous research and conducted further field studies analyzing the international network of activist groups that challenge the building and operation of military bases. Military bases, especially ones belonging to the USA, exist all around the planet. Many people who live next to these bases, however, question whether the benefits these bases bring in terms of national security are worth the dangers they pose to personal security within the communities that host them. Some of the problems include increased risk of environmental contamination, danger from unexploded ordnance and live fire training, noise from maneuvers, increased incidents of sexual violence by stationed troops, the occupation of large tracts of productive land, and, frequently, the compromised political sovereignty and self-determination of the places hosting these military activities. In short, bases can place great burdens on the communities that host them. The social movements that spring up around these bases use a variety of tactics and have developed extensive links of solidarity with groups opposing bases around the world. While this research project has been ongoing for over a decade in places such as Hawaii, Puerto Rico, the Marshall Islands, Ecuador, the USA, Guam, the Northern Mariana Islands, and the Philippines, the focus of the latest work has been in Okinawa, an island in the Western Pacific, annexed by Japan in the 1870s and then occupied for decades by the USA following World War II. Due to this double colonization by both Japan and the USA, Okinawa has become a hub with dozens of military bases. Furthermore, despite fierce local opposition, the U.S. and Japanese governments are currently pushing a plan to build a new U.S. Marine Corps air base by landfilling a seagrass and coral shoreline environment next to Hanoko Village in Nago, a municipality in northern Okinawa. This plan, however, has been blocked by activists on this colonized island who have been performing occupations of their own. Through sit-ins and blockades on both land and sea, activists have managed to block construction in the bay since it was approved by governments in Tokyo and Washington, D.C. back in 1996. In these actions, the activists are not just protesting and asking the Japanese and U.S. governments to act differently, they are actively trying to control and govern the space by occupying it with their bodies. In short, they are challenging the right of the Japanese and U.S. governments to govern this space. They are instead trying to govern it themselves according to ethics of environmental protection, peace, and demilitarization. Through an analysis of these protests and the way these kinds of direct action occupation tactics are circulated among activists from places as far away as Puerto Rico and Hawaii, this research suggests that protests like the ones seen in Okinawa are not isolated or local at all. Instead, they are supported and coordinated in quite complex ways across space. Drawing on perspectives from philosophers like Gilles Deleuze and Michel Foucault, as well as insights from the burgeoning field of social movement research in geography, sociology, women's studies, and anthropology, this research contends that these social movements behave across space and try to manifest power in space in much the same way as governments. Even though their aims, ethical positions, and organizing structures may be quite different, transnational social movements and governments Both use similar tactics of operating in networks across space and setting up archipelagos of spaces where their moral imperatives and governance can hold sway. The importance of this is that when we see social movement occupations, it is best not to see them as small or isolated protests that are unlikely to be effective. Instead, we should look for the hidden connections, the links of mutual aid that span the globe, the shared ethics, the communication that binds these protest sites together. When one looks at the history of many military base site occupations, for example, from Vieques, Puerto Rico, to Kaho'olawe and Makua Valley in Hawaii, to the Philippines, to Okinawa, it is critical to remember that these movements don't just ask governments for change. These movements physically challenge the might of governments, and frequently, they win.